All right, hi, I'm Snigtha and I'm one of the co-founders of YouthSTEM. And in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about non-Mendelian genetics. I'm specifically focusing on epistasis or epistasis. I'm not entirely sure how you're supposed to say it. It is a very fun word. Um, but yeah, I think it's pretty cool. And overall, non-Mendelian genetics aren't touched on as much within biology or AP biology, since they are definitely irregular and learning about them is specific to each case. There isn't really a pattern that you can follow across all forms of non-Mendelian genetics. But they are very interesting, and I'll do a brief overview of other forms of non-Mendelian genetics on the next slide. But I'll specifically focus on epistasis or epistasis again. Um, but yeah, definitely if any of them seem very interesting to you, I definitely encourage you to research further into them. There's a lot that you can learn about them, and they are irregular, so it is very unique to learn about each case. So definitely look further into what you're interested in. So yeah, to go to the next slide, this is where I talked about some examples. So the two most common forms of non-Mendelian genetics you'll probably hear about are incomplete dominance and codominance. These are often mixed up, but they are very different. Incomplete dominance is when phenotypes blend together. So basically, if you had a red flower and a white flower and their offspring was a pink flower, that would be incomplete dominance. Codominance is when there's a display of both phenotypes. So let's say if you had a red flower and a white flower, you won't get a pink flower, but you'll get a spotted red and white flower. So you're showing both phenotypes. Then there are multiple alleles, which is pretty simple. Just there are more than the typical two alleles that are at play, so it's just a lot more complex. There's pleiotropy, where a single gene is actually responsible for multiple traits. So again, this is just increasing the complexity of it, and it's just not this regular pattern that we've learned about in Mendelian genetics. There are lethal alleles which can cause an organism to die as an embryo. This is pretty interesting, I'd say, to learn about. I believe one example of this is dwarfism. If there is a single allele for dwarfism, then a person might display certain traits of dwarfism, such as having shortened limbs. But if an embryo has both of the lethal alleles for dwarfism, then that embryo will just die. So this is pretty interesting to learn about. I think it would definitely be very interesting to research further into if you're interested. Then there are sex linked, just meaning that the genes are linked to the sex chromosomes, which are X and Y. So it's not following that general pattern with randomness with the chromosomes when we're looking at Mendelian genetics. There's complementary genes where two genes together produce one trait. This is actually kind of similar to epistasis. Sorry, I keep saying it in both ways because I just do not know. But yeah, it is pretty similar, but it is different. And we'll talk about epistasis later. And then there's polygenic inheritance, where traits are determined by multiple genes, again, just more complex of a process. There's phenotypic plasticity, which is actually one of my favorites as well, where the expression of a gene is determined by environmental factors. This could be temperature or humidity, the amount of sunlight. So this is really cool to look at about how it might not just be a matter of genes, but also the environment that an organism is in to see what they actually express. Then there's incomplete penetrance, where the individuals of the genotype might not express the phenotype fully or at all. And this is pretty similar to the next one, which is variable expressivity, where just expression will differ among individuals. And then again, another common one of non-Mendelian genetics that you'll see is non-nuclear inheritance, where the offspring only gets DNA from the male or female parent. The most common form of this that you'll see is mitochondrial DNA, which is only inherited from the female side. So that's definitely a little irregular compared to Mendelian genetics and can definitely mess up analyzing that pattern. So um, it is very interesting and pretty common as well to look at that. So what is epistasis? Epistasis? Well, it's the expression of a gene, but this gene is affected by the expression of another inherited gene, or maybe not just another, maybe multiple other genes. And so I try to put into this little sentence with vague numbers so that you can just apply this to actual genes. But just to read it out, if the expression of gene number 2 depends on the expression of gene number 1, but gene number 1 is inactive, then the expression of gene number 2 will not occur. And gene number 1 is said to be epistatic to gene number 2. So basically, just to try to simplify it, it's a little confusing when you're just talking about terms in 1 and 2. And I have some examples later that will probably try to help explain it better. But if you have a certain gene and you like possess that gene, you would normally display it, but it's affected by whether or not another gene is also active or inactive. It completely depends on whether you express that gene based on that other independent gene. That's a little confusing to think about, but hopefully the example that I have on the next slide will help. So in this one, you can see how there are these like white eggplants, and you're looking at all the different crosses with these. But you can see the ones that are yellow are the ones that do not possess that dominant B gene. And because there's a lack of that expression, even when we had the dominant A gene, it is unable to express that white color because it's dependent on that B gene as well, and that B gene is not expressed. And then of course we have the green where just neither of the genes are expressed at all. So yeah, hopefully this kind of makes sense. You can look at the graphic further, pause the video and look at it. But basically you can see how these genes are linked and how the expression of a gene depends on a certain other independently occurring gene. Here's a pretty simple graphic, not looking at like the genes itself, but just the concept. So obviously hair color isn't this simple, but in this example, there's a gene for blonde hair and then there's a gene for red hair. And this is different for people. Some people have blonde hair, some people have red hair. But if you had the gene for baldness, then you will not see either the blonde hair or the red hair. And so in this case, the expression of the baldness gene does impact another independently occurring gene, which is the blonde hair or red hair. And so you can see how these are epistatic and linked to each other. So here's another example, just in words. The gene needed to make color is called tyrosinase. And if you don't have tyrosinase or if it's mutated, it results in albinism. And this will basically mean that your fur or skin will be white because you can't make pigment. But if there's another gene involved in making pigment and you have normal tyrosinase, you can see the brown mutation, you have a brown animal, so you can see that expression of color. But if you have a tyrosinase mutation and a brown mutation, it still looks like a tyrosinase mutation. It's all white. So you don't even see this brown expression at all. So you won't see if it has the brown mutation or not. So you can see how these are linked together, and you won't be able to see it if another trait isn't also being displayed. And so that was my last example. Hopefully it's a little less confusing. I think the best thing to simplify it down is just the simple concept of how baldness can affect whether or not you have blonde or red hair, for example. This is also a pretty good graphic. It's a little confusing to look at with the A's and B's, but maybe if you spend more time, it can be helpful. But hopefully this got you a little bit interested in learning more about non-Mendelian genetics. It doesn't have to be specifically epistasis or epistasis. But non-Mendelian genetics are definitely very interesting, and hopefully I gave a pretty good quick overview of what they can look like. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next video, and thank you for watching.